Morning, everyone. Very happy to be here. Go Knicks.
Yeah.
So want to get us started talking about high cost claimants and a lot going on here. So a lot of what we're going to talk about is predictability, and we get asked the question all the time. I think doing what I do more often than not, I say, why didn't we know this, right? How do you see things coming? So in terms of predictability, one large claim can blow up your budget, right? That's very clear. But it's not about the outcomes. It's about what's really driving it and how do you see which drivers are predictable and those that are not. Elina?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, as you said, right, I think the things to think about is what's predictable and what's preventable. So example, someone in your company has a great ski trip. They have a massive, accident. They're hella backed out. Not predictable, not preventable, right? High cost claim. But a lot of high cost claims, right, are predictable and, if not fully preventable, then modifiable. And so you can think about high cost claims in areas, right, like maternity, right, where if someone's had a Caesar before, they're very likely to have a Caesar again. If you had preeclampsia before, you're very likely to sort of progress on the next pregnancy. In our area, we deal with chronic disease, and that is both highly predictable and preventable, frankly, right? And so if you think about who's going to have a heart attack, who's going to have chronic kidney disease, who's going to develop MASLD, right? These are all very high cost claim situations. That is predictable, right? And it is actually preventable by treating earlier disease. And so I think we've basically been surprised. So by the way, my background, I came actually from the health plan space and actually in government markets. So I did a lot of Medicare and Medicaid, and things like chronic kidney disease and MASH, like those were normal in my population, right? And I think what's happened in commercial is as the acuity has gotten worse in a younger population, these things feel surprising, right? So if you look at your book today, you have chronic kidney disease in it. You didn't 5 to 8 years ago, right? And so the amount of support that's needed when you're looking at a book where you have folks with progressed diabetes, with MASH, with MASLD, with chronic kidney disease, with 8 comorbidities is very different than if you're sort of treating, pre-diabetes and, early hyperlipidemia. And so I think one of the things that you want to really focus on is understanding what are those sources of cost, right? And what are your real intervention points? I know some of the other folks a lot, right? You have site of care interventions, right? You have disease treatment interventions, but you have to know essentially what's impactable. And it's probably not going to be telling sort of the guy skiing or the gal skiing to not go, those are going to come. So it's what about all the other claims that are going to drive your book year on year on year that you can actually begin to bend trend on?
Yeah, so just to add to that, I think one of the things that we're seeing emerge is really this focus on, in many cases, you have a better chance of intervening with some of those folks as opposed to like the shock claimants like you were talking about. So I think there's been sort of this focus on not necessarily predicting or trying to predict every single catastrophic claimant, but instead, how can you sort of get ahead of some of these folks who have escalating costs before they accelerate too much?
Yeah, I think just to build on that and taking it out of the medical space and into the specialty drug space a little bit, although they're one and the same. I think about the amount of information and data that we have available to us now and just really practically looking at that and thinking about your future planning. So 1995, there were 30 specialty drugs on the market. Today, there's 950 or so specialty drugs that are available, and there's 7,000 specialty drugs in the pipeline, right? And so if you're thinking about what's driving your costs today and you're looking at the data and you're seeing that pharmacy costs are taking up a larger and larger portion of overall healthcare cost, and a lot of that is being driven by specialty drugs more and more, and there's 7,000 in the pipeline. You should start planning now around how you prevent, these big unexpected claims moving forward. To Ilana's point, and as the guy who gets into skiing, and you're not going to identify that, right? But you know that in 7,000 drugs are going to be hitting the market here over the next, 10 to 25 years, there's a good chance you're going to have a lot of specialty drug costs, right? So start planning now for programs that would mitigate that cost.
Great. So everyone wants to catch risk early. You mentioned data. Data is great, but the data is only as good as what are we going to do with it. And as you mentioned, it won't catch everything. But what does good look like? How do you use that data? And dare I say, how does AI play into this?
Yeah, so I'll go first on that one. I think what we're starting to see is sort of this shift, like I was talking about trying to predict who's going to potentially be a rising cost member in the next 6, maybe 12, maybe 18 months. And when we think about that, integration of those data sources becomes really important. So I think what we've seen in the past and what's kind of become status quo now is the integration of medical and pharmacy data. Still very important, but kind of, status quo at this point, either through a data warehouse, a navigation vendor, a consulting company, even a carrier. But what we're starting to see is the integration of other data sources too. So whether that's, well-being vendor data and utilization with those programs, it can potentially be even health administration data. So what can we learn about an individual when they're going through the annual enrollment process, through the plans and decisions that they're selecting at that point in time? It can even be provider search data. So in many cases, those can be sort of leading indicators as to the care that you might be getting in the next 6, 12 months, or even leaves data, absence data that sort of indicates if somebody has an emerging condition or maybe a worsening condition where they have to obviously take off work for those situations. So I think that's really important, is just how do we integrate the data, and then obviously using some of that technology to help support those individuals.
Yeah, so I can build on it. We run a claims analytics engine, machine learning driven, called the Ilant Rapid Returns. And what we actually focus on is taking your claims data and understanding sort of not only where are your high cost and rising risk opportunities, but where is their impactability. Look, observing a problem is great, but that's not going to bend trend next year. What we're actually looking to say is, can I actually understand what's driving sort of not, your high cost? To what extent is that actually impactable, right? So where are there interventions that are ROI positive near term? And then also, where can I actually predict someone who's below the line right now? So if you look at and we're a cardiometabolic company, so we're looking at obesity-related conditions, and we're building and saying, okay, where do I actually see someone where their clinical acuity is below where the line should be? And so I know that's a very directly rising risk member. And so for both of those populations, you can actually look at it and say, is there impactability here? And sort of to call out, in some sense, the elephant in the room, the impactability today in terms of cost of treatment for some members, right, may not be ROI positive. But if you actually do the analytics and you predict, there is a subset of the population across the books we've looked at, about 20 to 30% of those with metabolic disease are impactable, and impactable in a way that you can actually get, return within a 1, 2, 3 year time period. And so I think it's really important to look at that. And by the way, it's population specific, right? So we've looked at Medicaid plans, right, where the disease states that are impactable are very different than what you will see in your population. And so when we think about that, you have to really have this, frankly, analytics-driven approach to understand what is going to bend trend for you. And by the way, for every single person sitting here, that may be slightly different based on the populations you manage. For some of you, it might be different between your frontline, right, and your corporate staff. And so having that knowledge enables the design of a program to engage the folks that are most impactable.
AI is a tool today. It's a hard question to answer because it's going to be different 6 months from now, right? And so if you're a point solution, an insurance company, a large employer trying to manage your healthcare spend, and you're not using AI, then I think you're missing the mark, right? But as an AI forward company trying to think through how you use it, the sort of most effective use case right now, I think, is this concept of flagging, right? Understanding where patients are, who the patients are that, potentially match up with the right services that we can wrap around them. Things that we've done manually for a long time, right? Trying to identify patient trends and activity and match them up with the right services and identify emerging claimants. But the important thing is still what happens after you identify that patient, right? So like, you flagged them, AI's help us find those patients sooner, but you still need to wrap great services around those patients and make sure that you're delivering care in a unique way, or changing the structure of the way that the care is ultimately billed in order to create savings. AI agents aren't going to put, just speaking for us, AI agents aren't going to put a needle in somebody's arm,
right,
and deliver an infusion, right? And so, for us, it's thinking a lot about how do we leverage AI beyond that flagging point to give a better patient experience, to wrap the services around that patient that ultimately drives better outcomes, to hone in that treatment plan and really make sure that you're delivering a differentiated experience.
That makes sense. That's actually a great lead in too. So we've been talking about on the provider management side, but from the other side, the employee, the member side, navigation has been a tremendous part of employers' health plans for well over 10 years. And in my experience, working with navigation vendors and clients, there had always been the value prop that there's ROI in having those services wrapped around. So we can get at some of what we're talking about, like ahead of the early risk. So someone calls in for a particular situation and you dig a little deeper and it turns out there's something else going on. Do you think those models are helping, or are they working in terms of shifting utilization maybe to the right resources and really impacting costs?
Me? Sure. Yeah. From a guy who started a care navigation company, I still believe. I think we still have overutilization of the ER. We still have people receiving treatments for, use MRIs as an example in a hospital when they should be going to an imaging center, right? And so I think care navigation plays a huge role in potentially changing some of that behavior in a way that the health plan potentially cannot, and is more connected for an employer that may be offering multiple health plans. I think there's a real trust factor there as well, right? For patients and who they want to engage with, whether it's the health plan or a care navigator, to ultimately find those services and really understanding what the motivation is behind it. I don't know that the results have necessarily amounted to what we all expected 10 years ago. That said, I think that some of that also is on leaning in a little bit harder, right? So how do you make navigation the default rather than the option for a patient? How do you drive patients to the better resources at the right time? How does AI change that conversation for care navigators and enabling patients to do that sooner? So yeah, I still believe in navigation. I still think it's an important layer.
So I would say the data's really clear, right? That essentially going to a better surgeon, right, generates lower costs, better quality. We see that going to sort of expert physicians in various areas generates better outcomes, right? So like the data is actually incredibly clear, right? But the challenge is, I think, exactly what Rob said, which is how do you actually get people to access that? So we are super data driven. I can geek out on claims. There's members of my team that can geek out for a really long period of time around mechanisms of actions on various medications. But like at the end of the day, all of that is great. We treat humans. And humans, right, need to trust you. So you can be right and it doesn't matter. And so I think when I think about navigation, yes, we want, we really believe in expert clinical care. In our world, we really focus on physicians that actually know what they're doing. In cardiometabolic health, we look at sort of really understanding those pieces, but none of that matters if the person doesn't trust you. And so I think the failure point in a lot of this has actually been not combining sort of that analytics around understanding who you need to engage and building programs and the type of support and the type of sort of communication style that enables you to engage the folks that if they went to the better surgeon or if they went to the better physician would get better outcomes. And so for us, what's really important if you think about driving value is combining in some sense that scientific with the human to ultimately drive what we all want, right? Which is better outcomes in a financially compelling way.
Yeah, and just to add to that too, I would say there's also a lot of, or I would say a growing number of independent and third-party studies too that validate and provide evidence that there is a positive ROI even after considering program fees for a lot of these navigation solutions. So I agree with Rob. I think I'm a believer as well. But I think too, when we think about the outcomes they ultimately drive, obviously they're going to be dependent upon the engagement. But when we think about the outcomes that we've seen them drive, I know at Alight we've seen better, sort of shifts towards higher quality providers for those who utilize these services. We've seen just the transparency in pricing for people when they're doing, going to get care. It impacts the places that they get care, ultimately the medications that they choose to receive as well. And then Maybe the last outcome is just integrating that ecosystem of vendors, sort of helping people understand, where to go, when to go there, and how to utilize sort of everything that's available to them, across their entire program.
I just want to come back to a couple of comments, Rob, that you had made. It almost sounds like there has to be a shift around how navigation is deployed. So originally, employers, had navigation built into their program, and it was really an offering, right? Optional, engage if you want, sort of a carrot. And it feels like what I'm hearing is it almost has to change. We need that stick painted orange almost, right?
Yeah.
A little.
Yeah, I don't know if it's necessarily, the sticks are one option, right? I think that it's like rewiring your mind to thinking about what's the default, right? Like what's the default experience for a patient who's got a healthcare issue, and reworking that default for the patient to drive the outcome that you're looking for, right?
It's all about engagement.
Yeah.
That's what it comes down to. Engagement and trust.
Yeah.
Two threads. In terms of being responsible for a budget, I know I have clients who are responsible for their budgets, and this happened less than 24 hours ago, where a client had a wire request for $2 million for 1 week, and the typical request was $500,000. And so the question to me was, what happened? Okay, so I know the data I have access to, but what do you see as the non-negotiables in terms of data points and responsibility on all parties to make sure that there's as much predictability as possible?
Yep.
I jump. Yeah, I mean, I think you nailed it, right? Like, I think really it's overused, but the word transparency, I think is so important, and really just being able to understand exactly where those claims dollars are flowing. Right? We work in the world of J and Q codes, medically billed drugs. If you're an employer and you have a patient on an infusion drug, you get a J code claim that comes through your medical plan, and you have no idea what. Like it's the drug, it's the admin, it's the margin for the provider. It's everything built into one claim. Like that could be deconstructed in a very transparent way, which is to plug us what we do, right? So that's one thing. I think data access really important. So demanding, and this cuts both ways. I think you should demand data access from your vendors, your point solutions, and make sure that you have access to reporting and outcomes-based reporting and understand what's going on, and from your carriers, right? I think that too often we see employers that just sort of roll over on accepting that, their carrier won't provide them with data that is their data, right? I mean, ERISA protects that. I think that like getting that data is important. So yeah, I mean, I think those are the two big pieces to me. And then from a solution standpoint, it's claims validation, right? So can you validate my savings with actual claims cost savings?
So I'd say data's great, love data. What you actually need is insight, right? And so to me, it actually ties into that element of impactability and value. So what we do, we are a Center of Excellence, comprehensive obesity and cardiometabolic care. That means we literally treat individuals from essentially 1 comorbidity to 8 comorbidities. I've had a young woman that we treated that was homebound at 28 years old. So any sort of generic data point that says, average X for your population, like that's great, but like what does that mean, right? Because it means really different things. If I'm looking at someone that has chronic kidney disease, type 2 diabetes, hypertension, whereas if I'm looking at someone with PCOS, let's say, and hyperlipidemia, like there's different needs there. And so when you're looking at data, it's not just data, right? And I think one of the things we really focus on is this concept of sort of de-averaging care, right? That we actually really need to understand subpopulations. And that goes back to sort of the conversation we were having earlier, right? Which is if you want to look at your high cost claims, if you want to look at rising risk, it's not sort of broad based, right? It's targeted. And so when you're looking at a program, yes, you want to look at sort of average overall results, but like who are those impacting? Are you actually getting engagement from that high value population that can benefit from a Center of Excellence? Are you seeing impactability there? And so I think we want to look at data, but we want to get away from just data and averages to actually insights and impactability right now and then going forward.
Yeah, and then just one quick add, I think, is some sort of shared financial risk. So obviously making sure that these vendors are there, have some skin in the game, have some fees at risk. And ideally those fees are tied to outcomes and not just engagement, right? Activity is, obviously very important. Engagement is important, but ultimately we're trying to drive outcomes. So making sure that you have fees associated with the outcomes that you're ultimately trying to drive is super important as well.
Okay, thank you. So final question. For the employers that I work with, I know their programs have gotten incredibly more complex over the years, adding programs, adding different vendors, carving out pieces. But when you take a step back, what do you feel is really working, and which programs, care management, case management, carving out particular chronic conditions, do you think are really impacting the cost curve? Start with you again.
Sure, yeah. I think I have stronger feelings about what's not working versus what is working.
That's
right? And I think that a over-reliance or bundled approach with an ASO format, delivering high renewals, potentially double digits year after year, is not working, right? So something has to change. And that looks different for every employer, depending on what kind of population you have, what kind of conditions you're seeing in your data, whether you're addressing obesity or infusions or, MSK or whatever it is. And so I think the push there is to continue to really dive down on like where you can have measurable impact and trying to create specific programs around that population, because we always talk 80-20 rule or whatever. It's like the 98-2 rule, right? I mean, we can be really strategic with our approach to how we create better savings and better patient experiences. And then the other piece to that is like, if you're an employer and you're paying a cup of coffee per month for a PEPM product for your employees, just decide what is it that you want, right? If you purchase that product and you were expecting dramatic cost savings, then measure it on that. But if you purchase that product and it made your employees happier, and maybe you're breaking even or maybe not, just decide if that's okay as well, right? Because I think that mindset shift is an important thing.
Okay. Any final thoughts?
Look, I think it comes down to two things. You need to get to a place where you have expertise and alignment on the things that matter, right? And so I think you want to make sure that you get, I know there's quote unquote point solution fatigue, and that's fair. A lot of coordination is challenging, but like you need to get your major sort of cost drivers, conditions to a place where you feel like they are managed by someone who has expertise. And by the way, that's the same as true that we talked about, right? You go to a better surgeon, you get a better outcome. You want to make sure if you are doing a lot of knee replacements or colonoscopies or whatever it is in your population, make sure that those are going to a place of expertise, because that's going to generate better outcomes. And then the second piece is when you put in that expertise, get alignment, right? Because I do think the challenge with the PPMs and others is it's not aligned, right, to sort of what drives value. And if you can get the expertise and you can get the payment aligned, right, then you're going to get value both on the clinical and the financial side. And I think for any given sort of employer, book of business, population, what that looks like is going to be different on what's the level of sort of what's the number of solutions or what's the number of ways that you're addressing your population to get that combination of expertise and alignment.
I know we're short on time, so I'll be quick. So the last thing I would add is just, I think we're still solving for the fragmentation of the ecosystem that, employees and their families are sort of navigating. So making sure that we have communication strategies that are aligned so that they know exactly where to go and when to go there is still sort of a problem that I think we're all trying to solve for as well.
Well, thank you, everyone. I do want to leave everyone with a couple of thoughts. What I've heard, and this is consistent from every discussion that I've had here, is data matters, right? You need to have the data in order to have a strategy, and you need to lean into AI and engagement and communications. And I think trust is something that doesn't often come up, but absolutely critical. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you.